This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm speaking with landscape architect and author Sandra Schwarz about her new book, Restore, a guide to designing truly therapeutic green spaces. Sandra shares how her research led her to identify 6 universal qualities that make landscapes restorative, and why even the simplest contact with nature can support well-being. We talk about the complexities of owning nature, who restorative gardens are really for, and how designers can create spaces that meet people where they are. It's a thoughtful, hopeful conversation about greening with intention.
So I was a high school teacher for almost 20 years within the visual arts. So have always been interested in creative outlets, making, design, that kind of thing. And just found that I was getting, less enthusiastic about teaching for a little while, kind of took some breaks here and there. Wanted to become a scuba dive instructor up in Queensland and did a stint overseas working back in Germany where I was born. But yeah, it just kind of got to a point where I thought I'd rather get out of the teaching game while I'm not hating it so that I can leave on good terms, and actually taught a Year 10 technical drawing unit in my final year of teaching at a private school. So I was a high school teacher, and just really lit up the same way that the students did when we looked at building or creating an architect-based project. So they were told to design a house, but also the garden, and just talking to them about the idea of, greening a wall, or what about a courtyard, and what if you had a tree on the roof, and watching their eyes light up really made me connect to that gardening side that I'd discovered when I'd moved out on my own for the first time in my mid-20s. And so thought, okay, well, what else can I do? Apparently it's quite a common question for teachers to ask about what other career can we do and how are our skills transferable. And so did a test for careers advice, and it came out with the 2 things that most interested me, and one was landscape architecture, the other was art curation. And because of the gardening side, thought, well, I'll have a go at the landscape architecture side. Wasn't sure whether I would be able to do it, but after a really great meeting with a student advisor, figured out that yes, actually it was all possible, and it kind of changed my life in that moment to apply for the Master of Landscape Architecture at Melbourne University. And then from there, extended it just from the point of view of also travelling to Sweden to do, initially it was meant to be sort of an exchange or study abroad experience, but because of my German citizenship and just the way that everything kind of panned out, I actually did the full master over there as well. And over there, thankfully, got in touch with or witnessed the impact that a rehabilitation garden that was on the campus in Alnarp in southern Sweden near Malmö, that what that offered as possibilities. And I was just blown away by what gardens could actually do for people, and came out of our first visit and just said to my classmates, well, I know what my thesis is going to be about already. It's going to be something to do with this. And ever since then have really lent into the therapeutic landscape sort of side of things, and trying to understand from a design point of view, what can we design in that will actually create or virtually ensure that you're creating a restorative environment, or what one theory calls supportive environments, which means that the environment is supporting either the rehabilitation, the respite, the rest, the restoration of a person being in that space. And yeah, came back to Australia, finished my thesis here as well, which were sort of focused around 2 healthcare facilities. Have been volunteering at the Royal Talbot Rehabilitation Centre as part of Austin Health, which is a multi-campus healthcare complex here in Melbourne. And just really since then trying to work out how can I get into this field, and have worked as a landscape architect since then for 5 years with a small firm specialising in heritage and botanic gardens, so getting a little bit of my horticultural knowledge improved, and currently trying to lean more into the therapeutic landscapes side of things. So I've just completed a course in allied health assistance, which is basically the people that help OTs or occupational therapists and physios, and trying to understand, again, get that deeper understanding of what is it that people actually need within a space or a green space that's potentially going to help them heal, but also get a greater understanding of the needs. And yeah, that's sort of the practical side of how I turned the thesis into the book Restore, because it was about trying to share sort of all that learning and curiosity that I've had over the last few years.
Brilliant. That made me laugh because we had this careers test in the UK that sort of did the rounds on the internet for a bit, and I put all my stuff in really honestly, and my career came out as cinema projectionist, which I think basically just meant go and lock yourself in a dark room and never see anyone. But one of the other ones was journalist, so probably good that I'm doing a podcast.
Well, and also interacting with plants, maybe not a dark room, but plants would be good.
Yeah, propagationist.
I tried really hard in my one not to come out with a teacher again, and it still came up.
I think you are what you are on a deeper level, and these things know it. So you mentioned the book, which you very kindly sent me, and it is absolutely brilliant. I loved it. It's so good. It's so clever, so full of information. Who did you actually write it for, though?
Initially, the audience that I was aiming for was garden designers, landscape architects, I guess people that are literally and practically designing those spaces, simply because as I did the research of the thesis that this all started as, and it probably makes up about a quarter of the book now, I just was hearing examples where the theory and the practical were disconnecting. So there was understanding about what these spaces should be, but it's almost like that information wasn't getting to the designers themselves. And so sometimes those spaces would get designed in a way that wasn't necessarily working. Now, whether that's because somebody was more ego-driven and actually wasn't listening to what the user needed, or whether it was just inadvertent ignorance or time limits, it's going to be all sorts of reasons for that, but that made it the audience for me wanting to be designers. But then a conversation with a friend of mine fairly early on as I was starting to actually turn it into a book, and he's a home gardener living in the suburbs and had just lost his wife about I think 3 or 6 months before I spoke to him, and she had passed from cancer. And he actually said to me that he found what I was talking about really interesting, because he felt that he could have they could have, I guess, renovated or adjusted the garden a little bit to give her some of those qualities for her final days. And that made me realize that the audience could actually be a bit broader as well. But I guess at its base, it is aiming to kind of tap those people who are doing the designs or in charge of creating spaces, giving them a bit of a tap on the shoulder to say, have you considered this? Have you thought about this? Not trying to dictate how they do it, but just making sure that they have thought about it. And it's why I ended up calling them the design considerations as well, because I'm asking them to consider those.
Yeah, makes sense. So at the beginning of the book, you go very deeply. And again, I really enjoyed that bit of it because there was a lot of information in there that I hadn't come across before. So you go deeply into the history of humans and outside spaces. And I think you track pretty much as well, I think it's fair to say, the sort of disconnection from nature as we've gone along. And it made me think, is the concept of a garden, I suppose, problematic in and of itself because it's by its nature separating us from nature?
Yeah, I agree. And it is that kind of strange conundrum of, on the one hand, as a creative person, I can totally understand why somebody would want to create a space and watch it change, have all the benefits of that. And also, I guess, in certain circumstances where it was maybe a desert dwelling conqueror that created a space. Yes, sure, it was about showing power and might and wealth, but it was also about creating the type of space that wasn't natural there and therefore getting that respite. So, yeah, there is always that uncomfortable kind of mentality of it being a property. And I guess that's why I was a bit careful about calling it a garden in some cases. It's why I used the word green space, because I think when it becomes a park or an open space, like there are certain areas or spaces that we wouldn't call gardens. But yeah, certainly I agree that it is problematic. And I caught myself doing that and sort of then looking in the mirror and thinking, how does that apply to me? Because as said, I'm very lucky to own, so to speak. I mean, there's always here also the contemplation of, do I own the land? I mean, really, I don't. I'm on Wurundjeri land of the First Nations of Australia, and, they didn't sell it to me. So there's that whole complexity as well. And the fact that I'm creating, like just before speaking to you, I was very happy to be sitting on my deck for the first time this summer, because we've had a really wet spring, to actually sit on my deck in my hammock and be looking at some lush planting right next to me. But really, by creating that or managing it, pruning it, whatever I'm doing, I'm still controlling that space, and I'm doing it because I'm privileged enough to be seen as the owner of that space, and so I can. And it doesn't sit comfortably. Like when I examine it that way, I think, oh, okay. But then there's also a side of it that I understand the benefits of that kind of space for my physical and mental well-being and my creativity. And yes, obviously I recognize that I'm privileged to do that, but it's also, you can sort of get into your own head about how do you actually deal with that and how do you respond and what do you do about it, etc. But yeah, so I think it is exactly as you say, a garden is an enclosed entity by definition, and therefore there are definitely issues and challenges with that definition in itself.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing to just mull over or kind of, I think, hold in the back of your mind. There was a bit in the book and it really interested me, because I'm reading this book at the moment called Reconnections, which was recommended to me by the lovely Jo McCurr. Again, it tracks the kind of disconnect between humans and nature. And there's a bit in the book where you write, it seems we are strengthening our understanding of the therapeutic effects of the natural world on our well-being and progressing on the journey to value this connection fully. And then you say, how have I come to such a position of hope? And I thought, yes, how have you? Is it through your work, do you think? Are you inspired to think that people are, improving that connection?
Yeah, I think I'm just feeling like I hear about it more and more. Or I'm not sure whether this particular phrase is resonating in the UK or in Europe as much as it is here, but here we're more and more hearing the comment, we are nature. So going almost beyond that concept of we need to reconnect to nature, actually recognizing, and this is what First Nations worldviews are very much about, is that we are nature. We're part of it. And it's this separation that we even think of ourselves as separate in any way is quite ridiculous, because that's what we've made happen. We live in these boxes that are completely separated from the air outside, and they pump in air conditioning and things like that, and it's us that's actually separated it, or separated ourselves from the environment that we live in. And whether that's urban, natural, rural, whatever, we are part of it. I think yes, in a negative way, we're also recognizing our impact on it in terms of climate change, etc. But we're also starting to recognize that, going back to the simplicity of, and there's a lovely woman, very inspirational, Gina Chick, who won a TV show called Alone here, but very much in touch with nature and how she lives and etc. And she just talks about the disconnect that we have, even on a very simple level of checking the weather, for example, like how many of us actually stick our heads out our front doors to check how cold is it? Do I need a jacket? Is it windy? Do I need an umbrella? Most of us will today, due to the marketed efficiency of it, will actually look at our meteorology app on our phone to say, oh, yep, it's this temperature and it's going to be windy. And instead of actually connecting and sensing what is happening around us, and she talked about it in an interview where she'll look at where are the clouds moving? Like, do I have a breeze on my face? Does it feel like it's got heavier? Like actually taking in some of that information that's being communicated to us. And I think the fact that you've got people like her or certain designers, the fact that more people are writing about it is giving me hope, in the sense that people are recognizing it. And to be honest, when I saw it on our free-to-air TV channels, the fact that it doesn't even need to be paid for it, it's in the common news. If it's starting to show up there, then you know that it's actually becoming a more common and more spoken about and recognized topic. And so I feel like even though it's slow, and yes, I'd like it faster, and in that sense, unfortunately, even COVID helped, because I think it brought people back. Was just finishing reading Good Nature by Kathy Willis and talking about how many new gardeners there are since COVID. I think that's the sort of thing that gives me hope, is that people are either feeling completely overwhelmed and turning to the simplicity of actually deeply connecting to nature, but I'm certainly reading and hearing and seeing more about it. And that's not about filling my social media feed only with it. I feel like it is starting to infiltrate the general media as well. So I think that's where I'm starting to take the hope from. And then also, I think, just like yourself, the response to the book, people that heard the topic, everybody that I spoke to was like, oh, wow, that sounds so great. When's it coming out? Nobody questioned the topic other than the publishers that didn't want to publish it because it was a bit too niche. But overall, the actual personal response to the topic showed me, yep, people are interested in this. They're longing for it. There's a growth in therapeutic horticulture here in Australia. So, yeah, that's the stuff I think that has given me hope for this area.
So you have done such a lot of research, and the book is the product of that. And you've come up with universal qualities of restorative spaces, which must have been quite a task. How did you decide on those qualities?
So this is the bit that came out of the thesis that I did over in Sweden, and then came back to Melbourne to kind of confirm and say, or check whether was this a Scandinavian thing or did it feel more universal. And it was predominantly based on a literature review that formed the crux of the thesis, which for obvious reasons was called Translating the Theory into Practice, trying to understand what was the literature telling us, not from a design principle point of view, because I think they're design principles in themselves, but actually saying what are the qualities or features or elements that you need to include or should include in a garden space to make it restorative. And in my thesis, they were 10, and I literally just kind of created a huge Excel spreadsheet / matrix to anytime somebody picked something physical and practical out of, here's the proof for what made this garden restorative, and we've tested it, and this is what it was. Tracked that, and then consolidated it and synthesized it down to get the 10. And where did people agree? So there's only, I think, one point where I didn't use my usual rigorous thing of that it had to be proven or stated by at least 3 people. And that was just that Claire Cooper Marcus and Naomi Sachs in the US put a particular number to the ratio of hardscape to plants, and that's 70% plants to 30% hardscape. That was sort of the only one which I wanted to mention because of the fact that they had actually put a number on it. But everything else within the thesis was pretty much I needed at least 3 authors or 3 papers to back it up so that it wasn't just a single opinion. And then when it was becoming the book, I just reviewed my 10 areas again and kind of realized that a couple of them could actually be consolidated into fewer. And so that's how the 6 came about. And then I remember very early on telling a friend about what I thought they were and that I felt that they were probably universal, but that was sort of where the research was heading, was to try and show that. And she challenged me on it. She said she didn't think that it was, that it would be user connected. And for a little while I thought that was correct, because when I had initially started the thesis in Sweden, I was aiming to work within the areas that had the most amount of research, which was stress rehabilitation, cancer care, and dementia care. And what I realized during the thesis was that the needs, because it was stress dominated, for stress rehabilitation and cancer care were very similar needs in terms of what people responded to, but the dementia gardens were quite different, and often it felt like their needs were almost opposite to what some of the stress rehabilitation literature was saying. So at that time I probably didn't think it was universal, but when I came back to it and consolidated them, that's where it really felt very universal. And I thought, actually, all that's happening here is that they're working on a spectrum. So choice, for example, and this is the sample that I always give to people because it seems the most obvious, and that is, so the consideration of choice. If you are designing, for example, a garden, whether it be a sensory garden or a play garden or nature play, etc., for children, you're going to provide them with as much choice as you possibly can, because it's accompanying them on the learning journey. They're developing physically, they're developing cognitively. So the more choice you can give them to actually, increase and scaffold their own choice of challenge is the best that you can do with it. Whereas if you're creating a garden for an aged care facility where there is people living with dementia, you may actually want to dial down the level or the type of choice that you offer, not in the sense of not offering it, but the more choice you offer people with some of those conditions or certain types of dementia, they're actually going to get stressed and anxious by the fact that you've provided too much choice. And so circuitous walks, for example, are often used in dementia gardens, landmarks, things that people can orientate themselves to. So you're still considering how you're using choice, but you're dialing it down to actually suit them. So once I sort of worked that out and started really working it through each of the design considerations, I thought, yeah, these are actually universal. It doesn't matter who you are. You still need to have this considered and thought about, but how you need it to be executed is or can be quite different based on your physical and, cognitive and emotional needs. So, yeah, so that's how I sort of came back to, no, these actually are universal. And the more I read to kind of back it up, the more that got shown.
I just wanted to ask you a question, and I know it's probably a bit of a weird one, but I was thinking about my work, and I was talking to somebody who'd written a book on gardening psychology the other day, and I kind of thought, there are some people for whom a garden is just not the answer. Can we design in for them as well, or do they just get excluded from this kind of whole idea that gardens are therapy?
I think certainly there's a scale or, a whole spectrum of benefits and levels of how green spaces and gardens help people. I'm a little bit hesitant to say that I think there's people that it wouldn't help at all. I think there's certainly, and I know it's an example that's been talked about with autism, that there are gardens that get designed to actually completely reduce, if not almost pause, seasonality and that sort of thing, because people on a certain neurodivergent spectrum they don't respond to change at all. And so it's all about having the minimal amount of floral colour or detail. It's about really simplifying a green space. I think where I'm hesitating with it is that quite a bit of the things that I've read, both to prepare for my book, but also just now with Good Nature, I feel like there's actually a lot of physiological things like just seeing the colour green that is so soothing and sits at a spectrum level for the eye that's relaxing. Like, we don't need to try hard to take that in. It's just a very comfortable light level or colour level for the human eye. So things like that, and then the fractal shapes and patterns that we have. I think there are actually certain areas where I would almost question whether there are going to be people where it doesn't help at all. Like, I totally understand that somebody may not be into gardening, they may not want to have their hands in the soil, they may not really like being outside, they might be a little bit biophobic. But yeah, I'd be pretty stumped if there were people that were just where, as you said, a garden is just not for them at all. I think it might be, that somebody might only view it from inside, or have it be a bit like a background scape or something like that, and not necessarily physically engage with it. Like, that might not be for them. But I'd be really surprised if there were people that no possible view or landscape of nature made them calmer in some way.
Yeah, so it's about, I suppose, finding a way that kind of they can engage, but it might not be an obvious way. And then also perhaps not expecting great things on a very big level, because they may be getting benefits that aren't that tangible. So, because also you wrote, spending time in any kind of vegetated space improves our overall health and well-being. And I mean, that to me was quite bold, because I thought, oh, well, any green space, it could be a garden that is overgrown and on the face of it looks very unpromising. But as you say, it's those kind of below the level things that are happening that we don't even maybe acknowledge or haven't even realised yet. Is that a fair summary of that?
Yeah, I think so. And look, obviously there's going to be things that, like you say, if it's a completely unkempt and a really dense space, like Kathy Willis talks quite a bit about how she doesn't like very dense forests, which don't bother me at all. So I think there's certainly still personal preference in there. And I would certainly say that your average biodiverse garden is going to be much more beneficial than a flat, grassy soccer pitch. But if you actually bring it right down to the level of seeing green and seeing some kind of fractal vegetation, then yeah, any green space is it's going to be more beneficial than a concrete hardscape street. Like, I guess that's where I'm coming from. Like, if you've got a comparison between really what anybody would recognise as an urban space versus a green space, the green space, no matter what it is going to be more beneficial to us than a hard urban concrete landscape.
Yeah, basically everybody needs to get your book and go forth and green the place up. If somebody is thinking about looking at this aspect of their design, and I think probably, I hope a lot of people are considering this, and they're not just kind of focusing on things like budgetary stuff, aesthetic qualities. What would you say to them if they're dipping a toe in the water, or if they're sort of, maybe a bit hesitant about factoring this in?
I think because it's not dictated by a style or any kind of design preference or aesthetic, like, all of that gets laid over top. So I talked about a few times it being a foundational kind of basis. And I think from that point of view, I almost feel like you can't really go wrong with it, because if you choose to design these 6 universal design considerations in, it's never going to do any harm. Like, if you talk to your client or the user of that garden space and you're thinking, for example, about designing in water and you're hesitant about it, talk to them. Find out, do they even want it? Because it might be that they say, it doesn't need to be flowing, or maybe a budgetary constraint is that you can't have it flowing and, cleaned for the fact that a kid might dip their hand in it and stick it in their mouth. But what you can do is provide a bowl that gets filled with water by either a resident user or volunteer on a semi-regular basis, and therefore they have water, and that starts to actually enhance habitat, and so it brings in other life that they can watch. So I guess in a way there's nothing that I've read, and I've kept reading avidly ever since creating the book as well, and I've still, thankfully, not seen anything that's proven what my perceptions from all this research has been wrong as yet. And I just think because it's so foundational and can have so many extra layers on top, you can't really go wrong. And what it's asking you to do is to have a deeper conversation with the user. That's really all it is. How can we bring these things in for you because we know they're beneficial, and you can't really stuff that up.
Thank you to Sandra. And if you're interested in creating green spaces that truly support well-being, please consider picking up Restore and sharing the ideas with your community. If you like this episode, you might also enjoy episode 348, A Forest Fix, and episode 314, Nurturing Growth Inside and Out. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.